So how do you change the plastics packaging system? And beyond that, how do you change other systems like food, fashion, construction? And ultimately, how do you change the global economy?
Let me start by saying one of the problems in shifting the system is so huge. It's enormous. Not one of us can get our arms around it. And there are so many players and so many challenges, and they're all interconnected. So surely the first question has to be, how do you get started?
So the key first step is, what's the objective? The objective in this case, no waste, lower carbon footprint. It's not don't use a material, it's the circular economy. And then the second two critical elements to getting the whole thing started. One is some degree of regulation. The shift in the system needs some regulation, whether it's regulation to approve use of recycled materials that come back from the circular economy or set up collection systems. And then it needs demand. And that's particularly, when you ask what's the role of the Coke company, one thing we can do is send the demand signal. We're the buyer of the recycled material. And so the demand signal comes from companies like us saying, here's what we want to buy so that it meets our objectives of the circular economy. For me, the principal way of galvanizing the Coke company and the Coke system is to make it an inherent part of the business vision, which is actually, in a way, a force of driving the economics. Because if you can say the long-range vision of the circular economy is not just no waste and lower carbon footprint, but is actually lower cost than the alternative, then the system can galvanize itself around reorganizing and reorientating towards it.
And that's a perfect cue, Marianna, to ask you how you would actually move beyond what James has been talking about, which is plastics and waste. Where are the other kinds of systems that we ought to be looking for this kind of intervention in?
I think the problem is that it can't just be isolated companies or even, kind of one government here and there. It really has to go to the center of how we actually think about economic change and societal change. And in fact, one of the things I've been trying to do over the years is trying to help governments redesign their policies. So it's less about kind of pet projects, whether it's around plastic or any sort of particular area. It's really about saying, what does it mean to actually design policy to be goal-oriented, and less about kind of picking random sectors or even random types of technologies or types of firms. So what does it mean to actually design the contracts themselves to be outcomes oriented? The state, I really do think, at least in democratic societies, has the duty to actually set the direction for change, but then leave very open the how, right? You can't micromanage that process, but really setting a goal, again, plastic-free ocean, carbon neutral city, but also ones around inequality. And, that kind of mindset of picking the willing, having a mission-oriented, outcomes-oriented approach to policy, crowding in as many bottom-up solutions, that just requires a huge cultural shift as well within the public service. It means, experimenting, risk-taking, seeing yourself as a co-creator, co-shaper of markets of the future, not just a fixer of markets. Because one of the big systems problems we have is that we keep waiting for the system to break down or to maybe break down before we really think about any sort of government policy.
Shifting the system requires action from all actors, government, business and citizens. Jyrki Katainen, the former Prime Minister of Finland and now President of Sitra, has witnessed the circular economy move from just a fringe idea to the mainstream.
Being in the Commission and being one of those who was introducing the circular economy as a policy matter in the European level, I must admit that it is the first time when I experienced that systemic change can really happen in relatively short period of time. So I started to believe that all the single pieces of market regulation, for instance, or all the legislative proposals concerning product policy, they are parts of the systemic change. And we saw already that market is changing.
And Finland has a really, really big bioeconomy. The biomass and the nature-based economy is really important in the country's GDP. So how are you tackling this nationally? Is it through potentially having better indicators to understand the impact, or to make the contribution of bio-sourced materials greater in the economy, for instance? What is the country doing on that level?
So we cannot pretend that just protecting certain amount of the country or the water area is enough. We have to do a systemic change how our economy is functioning, what kind of choices consumers can do, what is the role of municipalities or public sector, for instance, when doing city planning, etc. So this again needs a systemic change, but it's very practical and pragmatic systemic change which is needed.
Circular economy is a huge innovation opportunity. It requires the discovery and scale-up of new production, distribution, and recycling infrastructure, a new generation of materials, and a wave of new business models. But all of this needs to happen at great speed.
To do this, we need a strategic and ambitious public-private investment. Let's zoom in. Materials innovation could offer profound new opportunities and unlock the shift to a circular economy.
There's a focus on biomaterials. What is it that's exciting about the idea of biomaterials? I guess you tapped into it a little bit just now, but why the focus on biomaterials?
Yes, well, the potential of biomaterials is massive when you look actually at just the volume of biopolymers that are in flow in the global biosphere that compose and make up the incredible material production that the natural world is made out of. And so, for instance, you can look at the biopolymer chitin, which is composes the exoskeletons of insects, the crustacean shells, as well as the cell walls of fungi. It's an incredible biopolymer that's so abundant. It's about 100 billion tons in flow in the biosphere annually. And that's actually the amount of chitin produced in 1 year is equivalent to greater than 300 years of the current worldwide plastics production. So it just shows the kind of scale of materials that we could actually be building with and developing.
How do we think about sort of the next generation and making sure that we're thinking about the consequences of this next generation of materials?
I think that materials were understood as kind of singular things. You didn't think much about them. If you're an architect, you just specify them. In other words, you order them and they come to you, somewhat like Amazon actually, but big, vast masses of material coming to a building site. And then once they were in a building, you didn't think much about them. You didn't think much about their end of life. Somehow, when the building, was taken down or whatever, they went into a landfill. So that's extremely linear. And I think that we are seeing a shift from a linear, singular notion of one material at a time that we understand and use to a much more plural ecology of materials where we're really thinking about what has been called an externality. In other words, we're thinking about the energy that goes into extracting that material, into processing it, into augmenting it, into getting it to the building, transportation, labor, and then how, at the end of life, it returns back into that larger ecology, returns back safely and in a way that it can be upcycled or reused.
What kind of molecule could store the entirety of the world's energy in scale? I mean, it will be a fraction of it, but the same order of magnitude. And when the reason we're thinking about this problem is you think about, going 100% to renewables, you need to have batteries. And in those batteries, you probably don't want to use transition metals that were extracted from mines with terrible conditions, but rather, why not think of organic molecules? And for example, in that particular case, together with Roy Gordon and Mike Aziz, early on, about 5 years ago, we thought about what molecules does our body use to store energy. And turns out there's this biomolecule called quinone that plants and our body uses all the time to transport electrons. And we said, if it transports electrons in our body, why don't we just mass scale and imagine a world where we can mass scale and produce a quinone molecule to store all the world's energy. But then the question was, which quinone or quinone-like molecule? Now we're working in other molecular classes that are similar to it. And that led us to search literally about 1 million molecules in the computer so far. And many of them have been tested experimentally, both at Harvard and now in Toronto, where I am, to fulfill this role, right? They have to be long-lived, but they also have to be non-toxic. Ideally, we want to drink our battery. That's our joke, but it's kind of true. We really want to do is drink our own batteries.